All right, I'm going to begin our final class discussing Tolkien's great work, The Lord of the Rings. And with that discussion, try to draw together some of the threads of the course as a whole, but in particular, the section related to Tolkien and the themes of subcreation, the themes of fairy and myth making, but also to connect it with what I think is evident in that work, which is a contemporary critique of scientism and the machine age in which Tolkien was living, and the way that he was connecting those things with the use of magic that was characteristic of Sauron and Saruman, and making a commentary on the use of magic for the purposes of power, which again had not only social implications, but also political ones, and also bore directly on the idea of creativity and of the good, which are definitely part of Tolkien's broad portrait. And I'm going to begin, however, with a reading, and the reading is from The Two Towers, and it is at the Crossroads. It's the journey to the Crossroads, so it's chapter, chapter 7 of the fourth part of the whole Lord of the Rings series. And they've come to the crossroads when Gollum is leading Frodo and Sam towards Mount Doom, doing what he had agreed to do. And they've come, as I say, to the crossroads. And I'll read some extracts, so not the entirety of the section. But as they became aware, as they drew near, they became aware that these were of vast size, very ancient it seemed, and still towering high, though their tops were gaunt and broken, as if tempest and lightning blast had swept across them, but had failed to kill them or to shake their fathomless. Now, this was a reference to trees, vast trees that had grown deep into the earth, a theme that we've already seen presented repeatedly throughout the Lord of the Rings in reference to the Ents and the trees that are part of the created order, which seem to stand the test of time and to some extent represent a virtue that has not yet been eradicated from Middle-earth. And Gollum says, "The crossroads, yes," whispered Gollum, the first words that he had spoken since they left their hiding place. "We must go that way." Turning eastward now, he led them up the slope, and then suddenly there it was before them, the southward road, winding its way about the outer feet of the mountains until presently it plunged into the great ring of trees. "This is the only way," whispered Gollum. "No paths beyond the road, no paths. We must go to the crossroads, but make haste, be silent." So down they go, and as they pass, there's a moment, and Frodo is filled with dread. And then he became aware that a light was shining. He saw it glowing on Sam's face behind him. Turning towards it, he saw beyond an arch of boughs the road to Osgiliath, running almost as straight as a stretched ribbon down into the west. There, far away beyond sad Gondor, now overwhelmed in shade, the sun was sinking, finding at last the hem of the great slow rolling pall of cloud and falling in an ominous fire towards the yet unsullied sea. The brief glow fell upon a huge sitting figure, still and solemn as the great stone kings of Argonath. The years had gnawed it, and violent hands had maimed it. Its head was gone, and in its place was set in mockery a round rough-hewn stone, rudely painted by savage hands in the likeness of a grinning face, with one large red eye in the midst of its forehead. Upon its knees and mighty chair, and all about the pedestal, were idle scrawls mixed with the foul symbols that the maggot folk of Mordor used. Suddenly, caught by the level beams, Frodo saw the old king's head. It was lying rolled away by the roadside. "Look, Sam," he cried, startled into speech. "Look, the king has got a crown again." The eyes were hollow and the carven beard was broken, but about the high, stern forehead there was a coronal of silver and gold. A trailing plant with flowers like small white stars had bound itself across the brows as if in reverence for the fallen king, and in the crevices of his stony hair, yellow stonecrop gleamed. "They cannot conquer forever," said Frodo, and then suddenly the brief glimpse was gone. The sun dipped and vanished, and as if at the shuttering of a lamp, black night fell. Now, in these brief lines, I believe that what Tolkien is doing for us emblematically is presenting a symbol, an image of the themes of the Lord of the Rings, the way in which, by miracle of grace, we are given a glimpse, just a glimpse, of the order of the cosmos, a cosmos which is presented in its origins not in the Lord of the Rings itself, but as I said to you, in the Silmarillion, in the account of the creation of things by Ilúvatar. And we can see at various key phases in the Lord of the Rings, as well as in The Hobbit and in other works, the light of the sun working almost as a finger of providence, the presence of the creator himself breaking through the shadows or even the darkness to anticipate a victory that is to come. Now, we've seen it obviously in the battle of Pelennor Fields, when the riders of Rohan emerge on the brow of the hill to basically alleviate the distress of Gondor, which is about to fall. We also see it in the Two Towers, in that great battle when Gandalf emerges on the 5th day. It is as much, and I thought this was rather well done in the film, it is as much the light that destroys the enemies of the good folk led by Theoden, as it is Theoden's own martial forces, which quite frankly are by this point defeated. He rides out, but he rides out as much in desperation with a faint hope as he does with a sense of impending victory. The victory comes unexpectedly, and again, it comes through the means of light. Well, here we see that same light being presented in a rather different way. It puts a light upon a vision of a fallen and broken humanity, that broken humanity which is in the form of a king. The king has lost its head. That head has been replaced by something perverted, something distorted, put there by the hands of the orcs, who seem to represent creativity gone wrong, not for the purposes of subcreation, but rather of perversion, of domination, of destruction. And yet there's a light that shines there, and and in the form of the stone crop and the trailing plant, the king's crown shines, and something is anticipated there in Tolkien's presentation, which I think the whole corpus of his writing points towards, and is a sort of a key for us to understand exactly Tolkien's view of artistic creation. And I'm going to look at some passages from his works and just recapitulate what I've already said from the outset there. And I think we can see that it holds not only for Tolkien's work, but also for Lewis's, namely their idea of subcreation and the way in which fantasy literature, whether it's in the form of fantasy like Tolkien's work or in the form of science fiction like Lewis's, nonetheless is pointing towards a form of escape. But the escape not as a flight from reality, but rather as a leaning towards, or in fact an embrace of a true reality, which is not yet here and yet will be to come. And they believe that in hope and in faith, and they can see that in its roots and origins already presented in the created order. And the nature of that escape is spoken of by Tolkien in his book on fairy stories. I've taken here from the collection, including Tree and Leaf, Leaf by Nagel, the poem Mythopoeia. But it's in his lengthy discussion of fairy stories that I think we find the clearest discussion, at least extended discussion of what Tolkien believes that he's doing in his fiction, and I also think that Lewis believes that he is doing in his fiction. And namely, it is presenting the Great Escape. Now, the Great Escape's a famous film of the Second World War about escape from Nazi Germany, or from a prison camp. But here by the Great Escape, he means something rather different. It's the escape from death. And it's page 68 I'm reading from here. Tolkien writes, fairy stories provide many examples and modes of the oldest and deepest desire, the great escape, the escape from death. He says that these modes might be called the genuine escapist, or I would say fugitive spirit. But so do other stories, notably those of scientific inspiration, reference to the science fiction genre, and so do other studies. Fairy stories are made by men, not by fairies. The human stories of the elves are doubtless full of the escape from deathlessness, but our stories cannot be expected always to rise above our common level. They often do. Few lessons are taught more clearly in them than the burden of that kind of immortality, or rather endless serial living to which the fugitive would fly. For the fairy story is especially apt to teach such things of old and still today. Death is the theme that most inspired George MacDonald. But the consolation of fairy stories has another aspect of the imaginative satisfaction of ancient than the imaginative satisfaction of ancient desires. Far more important is the consolation of the happy ending. Almost, I would venture to assert that all complete fairy stories must have it. At least, I would say that tragedy is the true form of drama, its highest function. But the opposite is true of fairy story. Since we do not appear to possess a word that expresses this opposite, I will call it eucatastrophe. The eucatastrophic tale is the true form of fairy tale and its highest function. The consolation of fairy stories, the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly, of the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn, for there is no true end to any fairy tale, this joy, which is one of the things which fairy stories can produce supremely well, is not essentially escapist nor fugitive. In its fairy tale or otherworld setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of this catastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of such evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and insofar is evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. Now, this theme of joy, which marked the autobiography of C.S. Lewis, Surprised by Joy, was also the subject, as we saw earlier on in the course, in Lewis's work, The Weight of Glory. He spoke of that same sense, and it does pervade the fiction of both authors. And ultimately, I think it is the thread that unites both authors and their corpus of work. But also it deals with the other thing that they are encountering, namely death and mortality, and the way in which mortality, which is the great curse placed on mankind as a consequence for Christians of original sin, as death follows sin and was not a part of the created order as God originally created it. those things are nonetheless going to be overcome through an act of redemption, a miraculous act of grace, which of course is represented in the story of Good Friday, Easter Sunday, the events that we, in terms of our temporal existence, have just experienced the past few days. The imminence of death, but also the possibility of resurrection and renewal and redemption, of light conquering the darkness. Both men present that in their fiction, and I thought Lewis in particular, in The Weight of Glory, gave a magnificent representation of the way in which this life does exactly that in the best forms of art. But there is a mirror image of that. And the mirror image of that, the attempt to escape death and mortality, is also seen in the works of the transhumanist establishment and in the ideology of scientism, or of Nietzscheanism, Prometheanism, as I've suggested from the outset of the course, which is a concurrent theme which we can see alongside of the corpus of literature that Lewis and Tolkien are writing. And I think we need to see these two in running in contrast with that grand theme, which is not only the theme of literature, but more particularly of a means of living life of the modern world, at least a modern world that has abandoned the path of wisdom and is seeking to break nature in order to give humans eternal life without God. And in both Lewis and Tolkien's eyes, this is akin to the use of magic, and a magic not used for good purposes, but rather just simply for the extension of life without any sense of the meaning and purpose of life. So it's like, as Bilbo remarks to Frodo, having worn the ring, he feels like butter spread out over too much bread. He's worn out, even though his days have been lengthened. That, again, image is how Tolkien understands the efforts of his contemporaries to extend life, and yet never to experience it in its fullness, which is a life in relation to God, and a life of virtue, not one which is constructed in accordance with the transhumanist scientistic establishment. Now, this path of light and of grace, which breaks into this novel, a novel, remember, which does not mention God, in which there is no explicit religious observance, but is nonetheless implicit, and for the attentive reader, obvious throughout the corpus of work, is juxtaposed to the actions of Sauron, the Lord of the Rings. And we have something of the workings, and I spoke about this at considerable length when discussing the way in which evil was presented in the Lord of the Rings, in characteristically Augustinian form as a privation of the good. We can see how Gandalf has presented this. I think he presents it most clearly for us when he explains to Aragorn that it is the pride of the Dark Lord that has rendered him blind, as opposed to seeing the light that Frodo, I just mentioned, has seen in the statue of the king. And he says that he does not perceive the purposes of his enemies. And he says Gandalf to Aragorn, he supposes that we're all going to Minas Tirith, for that is what he would himself have done in our place. And why does he think so? Because, again, he seeks to control all power. And in anyone who would seek to do powerful things would do exactly that. That's exactly what characterizes Boromir's motivations before he repented and then lay down his life for his enemies. But it is in his pride that he fears that a mighty warrior might appear to oppose him and then cast him down and take his place. and that we should cast him down, Gandalf says, and have no one in his place is not a thought that occurs to his mind. That we should try to destroy the ring itself has not yet entered into his darkest dream, in which no doubt you will see our good fortune and our hope. Our hope is in the fact that he cannot imagine a relation to the possibility of power that would eschew that possibility. And so this illustrates Tolkien, and or rather Gandalf as a spokesman, brings to the fore to our minds the self-destructive tendency of evil, and how the presuppositions of pride will darken the minds of those who are bent upon power, and they will not be able to see very clearly what is in fact unfolding before them. And whereas it is the humble hobbit, the foolish hobbit, and the foolish company, whose course of action is derided by Boromir as folly, is actually a source of wisdom and a path by which evil can actually ultimately be destroyed in this work. As Gandalf remarks, it has long been said, oft evil will shall evil mar. Now, in Tolkien's letters, Tolkien asserts, for all his claim that the Lord of the Rings is not allegorical, he, as I said, will also admit that there are allegorical ways of reading it. So it's not allegorical in the sense it is to be seen as an allegory of Christian truth per se. Nonetheless, it is an allegory. And then what is it an allegory of? He says it is an allegory of power exerted for domination. And so power really is the theme of the Lord of the Rings, or at least the motivation of those who, like the Dark Lord Sauron, are trying to control all of life for the purposes of, as I say, domination, which Tolkien will see is the main purpose of science, at least post Francis Bacon, power over nature, not for the purposes of goodness or of giving honor and glory to God, but rather for bringing everything under the dominion of mankind, and thereby the oppression of mankind. And this is, in Tolkien's mind, an insidious thing. And this insidious nature of the application of knowledge for the purposes of domination, I think is clear in his portrait of how knowledge is used, first of all by Sauron, but also by Saruman, and as a corollary, as an application to the way in which science is used in his day to bring about change or so-called progress, a progress which is not here to stay. It's here to be presently used, only to be replaced by something more progressive in days ahead, without anything being affected other than the growth of domination. And so he says, he adds in that same letter that it's not even power or domination which are the real center of the story, but the real theme is about something much more permanent and difficult, namely death and immortality. So that reminds us, and I do think that really this is what the Lord of the Rings ultimately is about, and the whole of Tolkien's corpus of writing is about the way in which things such as death and judgment and heaven and hell are being presented in our modern world. The contrast between the eternity of God and his kingdom and the temporal longevity offered by scientism and its works. And we have to understand that the temporal longevity is not the same as eternity. And yet temporal longevity is all that can be achieved by, let's say, the elves. They are deathless, but this deathlessness is not ipso facto a good thing in and of itself. And in some sense, the elves are cursed by their long life. They're not blessed by it in the same way the long life bestowed upon those that carry the ring or wield the ring. Their life has also been extended, and yet it's a cursed existence. It's a shadowy existence, and we've seen, I mentioned already in our class, that when Gandalf looks upon Frodo's hand when he's lying in Elrond's council asleep, he can see there's a faint translucence about the hand, which suggests the power of bringing him into the dominion of the wraiths. It's already working its way upon him. But the contrast is particularly weighed out in the way in which we see the company, the fellowship, being commended by Tolkien as the path of virtue, living in obedience and in deference to the created order as it was originally created, reflecting the working of Manwë and Ilúvatar, and also in the deployment of their own skills and aptitudes in the means of what Tolkien himself uses, subcreation, but also in the way that figures like the elves and the hobbits and the dwarves and even men will utilize their skill and their craft. So there's a use of art and technology which respects the prior claims of the creator and his creation, acknowledges it in all of his ways. And in that sense, it is a right application of art. And that's contrasted with the false, insidious application of art, which are used by the orcs and the fallen servants, proud servants, such as Saruman and Sauron, who become just like Melkor, figures of discord. Remember, Melkor in the earliest drafts of Tolkien's Silmarillion was written as Melko, which means the mighty one. Melkor literally means he who arises in might. And but that name he forfeits, and the Noldor, who among the elves suffered most from his malice, will not even utter it. And they name him Morgoth, the dark enemy of the world. So we can see an analogy being presented here between Lucifer, who was the brightest of the angels, the light bearer, thereafter being named Satan, the adversary, the enemy. So we can see an analogy here between Morgoth, Satan, and the enemy having effectively the same meaning. And all of them, 3 words in 3 different languages, represent the primal enemy of humanity, basically connecting Melkor with Lucifer. And we can see this then being played out in the works of their servants and the destructive consequences thereof. Now, in this work, Morgoth's Ring, which I recommend to you, it's very interesting. In Morgoth's Ring, which is volume 10 of the History of Middle-earth, Tolkien is at pains with the figure of Melkor / Morgoth. And Christopher Tolkien, in the foreword to that work, comments that the power and significance of Melkor / Morgoth was enlarged to become the ground and source of the corruption of Arda. And whereas we can see that Sauron's power is concentrated in the form of the One Ring, Morgoth's greater and far more diabolical power was dispersed into the very matter of Arda itself. So the creation itself has been corrupted by this, and the whole of Middle-earth then becomes effectively Morgoth's ring. And this explains why in The Lord of the Rings, when the great ring of power of Sauron is destroyed and his power broken with it, that evil nonetheless persists. It endures the destruction of Sauron's ring, because really it's the whole creation which has been corrupted by Melkor / Morgoth, which needs to be defeated. And ultimately, that will not be the work of this fellowship. It will be the work of a later figure who's been symbolized by the light, which is conquering the darkness with which I began my reading, namely Christ himself, the light of the world. But as I say, those that represent evil and its works live in defiance of that good light and in defiance of the hierarchy of God, his created order, and those that reflect that the goodness of the created order and use their gifts for subcreation. And they seek to usurp the rightful order for the purposes of their own domination. And so we can see that there is a link then between the perverted uses of magic, of subcreation, the way in which Sauron uses it and Melkor uses it, but also the orcs to a lesser extent, and power in the political sense. And so there is an inextricable sense of connection between the use of magic or the use of science and politics. And so for that reason, many have seen the Lord of the Rings as a commentary on politics, as basically a political allegory. I don't think it's quite so simple or can be reduced to that, but the analogies that are to be seen there are abundantly clear, and I think have some accuracy, and Tolkien even acknowledges it, although he doesn't want it to be reduced to mere political allegory. Remember, the backdrop for the writing of the Lord of the Rings is the Second World War and the Cold War that follows it. And so some have suggested, and I think there's substance to the suggestion, that Mordor represents communism, whereas Isengard represents Nazism, and Gondor, the Allied powers, and the Shire, maybe some idealized form of England. Now, Tolkien is not altogether comfortable with this because he doesn't want to be seen as a mere propagandist, as making some sort of political commentary, strictly speaking, or reducible simply to political readings. But there is application there to politics, which I think Tolkien would readily acknowledge. And so the eye of Sauron can clearly be seen to have parallels to the efforts of totalitarian regimes to usurp divine power through the application or the attempts to develop omniscience, omniscience like God, or an omnipotence like God, and even omnipresence, the presence of totalitarian regimes in the private realm of everyone's lives. And so there's a sort of a secular tyranny in which the old Lord of the Rings was written, which formed the backdrop of Tolkien's novel and remains with us to this day, which I think is the very reason why the Lord of the Rings seems so oddly relevant. And remember, Tolkien is writing this work at the very same time that George Orwell is writing his dystopian work, 1984. Very many odd, but obviously unmissable parallels between those two works. And we can even note, and this is an interesting connection, and it's a connection that's made by Joseph Pearce in his work, Frodo's Journey, Discovering the Hidden Meaning of the Lord of the Rings, a sort of a thematic connection, which we can see in the naming of the two leaders of men, Denethor and Theoden, almost being anagrams, phonetic anagrams. Denethor suggests the word Thor in that, a pagan god, and Theoden from Theos, the one true God. And note how the two act as foils for one another, one as a king who has lost hope and given in to despair. Remember, he's being misled by the Palantir, which he is using. There's nothing wrong with the Palantir itself, but shorn of the hope of redemption and light and power that goes beyond his power, Denethor descends into madness and ultimately takes his own life in despair, and Gandalf's famous words to him is that authority is not given to you, steward of Gondor, to order the hour of your death. And only the heathen kings under the dominion of the dark power did thus, slaying themselves in pride and despair, murdering their kin to ease their own death. So there's a thematic pairing there between the two that really does contrast the pagan despair of Denethor with the Christian hope which Theoden, king, ultimately represents. Remember, Theoden is delivered from the wiles of Wormtongue, who has been deceiving him, breathing poison into his mind. And remember, again, the light which dispels that when Gandalf comes along and speaks and uses his staff, which is not a form of magic, but a form of subcreation. It's a tool, but it's a tool not for the purposes of domination, but rather of liberating the natural order from the curse. And he liberates the mind of Theoden so that he can have hope for the future. And of course, that's a turning point in Theoden's life, which then leads him to lead his people to the defense against their imminent destruction at the hands of Saruman and the forces of Isengard. And this theme of the way in which light conquers darkness is presented in various key scenes in the Lord of the Rings. I've already alluded to that one in which we've seen the statue, but there are more momentous events in the work. Let's take in the encounter of with Shelob, this horrible scene in which, if you recall, Frodo has been rendered senseless, and Sam is left on his own, alone with only the implement of the file of Galadriel. Samwise Gamgee facing imminent death in his darkest hour, and he recalls what had been said to him by Galadriel when in the darkest place. A thought came to him as if some remote voice had spoken. He fumbles in his breast pocket. He feels the file of Galadriel there, and he says, "Galadriel," he said faintly, and then he heard voices far off but clear, the crying of the elves as they walked under the stars in the beloved shadows of the Shire, and the music of the elves as if it came through his sleep in the hall of fire in the house of Elrond. Gilthoniel a Elbereth, and then his tongue was loosed, and his voice cried in a language which he did not know. A Elbereth Gilthoniel a Omenel Palandiriel, Nenalansi en Gurithos o Tironin Fanulios. So these elvish words are addressed to an angelic being. And note that they words come to him. He does not even know these words. An utterance is given to him, which gives is a prayer, and the prayer is dedicated to Elbereth. Now Elbereth is used in Tolkien's Legendarium as a figure whose face radiates the light of God. She's one of the Vala, by the way. She's an archangel of sorts, most hated by Melkor, by the way. And Shelob, on the other hand, is a demonic spirit who shares Melkor's hatred of the divine light that's shining forth from Galadriel's fire, but she fears it as well. And there's a spiritual encounter here, and no such terror out of heaven, writes Tolkien, had ever burned in Shelob's face before. The beams of it entered into her wounded head and scored it with unbearable pain, and the dreadful infection of light spread from eye to eye. She fell back, beating the air with her forelegs, her sight blasted by inner lightnings, her mind in agony. So this sheer not only presence of light, but the power of the light for the purposes of defeating evil are evident in that passage. Likewise, in that moment in The Lord of the Rings, when Éowyn, the shield maiden of Rohan, vanquishes the witch king of Angmar, the Lord of the Nazgul, in the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Remember, she's in the guise of a male warrior riding forth because she will not remain behind. Encounters a figure that is most terrifying of all of the figures that we actually encounter in The Lord of the Rings. Remember, we actually never meet Sauron. We meet the Witch King of Angmar, nonetheless, the greatest of Sauron's ring wraiths, in the face of which even the power of Gandalf had wavered. And he calls her a fool for believing that she could possibly oppose him. But note the spiritual strength which she possesses to even muster up her courage to do so. And he says, "Hinder me, thou fool, no living man may hinder me." And then in the words that really seem to echo almost that famous passage in Macbeth, when we hear, "No one of woman born may oppose me," she, with a play on that, "But no living man am I," Éowyn replies, "You look upon a woman. Éowyn I am, Éomund's daughter." And at that explanation, the Witch King of Angmar hesitates and becomes fearful, as if in sudden doubt, in the same way that we hear Sauron is also thrown into sudden doubt by events that later occur. Portents of doom at her hands, as if the hand of providence itself has intervened. And it's telling, I think, for Tolkien, remember, who's not just Christian as Lewis is, but Catholic, that the implement of satanic opposition is in the form of a woman. I think Éowyn here represents a sort of a figure of Eve, whose fidelity to God will not only bring forth the Savior, but thereby crush the serpent underfoot. In fact, in some representations of Eve, it's Eve who's crushing the serpent underfoot. I think this is a misunderstanding on their part of exactly what is going on in the revelation that's given to Eve. But nonetheless, there is a conquest of the power of Satan through the woman. And this is exactly what's going on here, is I think that Éowyn represents a foretaste of the ultimate defeat of evil, which will happen from the seed of the woman. But here it is the woman herself who will trample this instrument of evil, namely the Witch King of Angmar, underfoot. The church at war, as it were, with the powers of darkness. The true shield maiden of Rohan crushing the serpent under her foot, in this case, as I say, the Witch King of Angmar. But those portents of the destruction of evil, miraculous as they are not the most important means of the encounter between good and evil. The most important are taking place at the same time off stage, as we flip back and forth between Frodo and Sam on the one hand, and the riders of the Fellowship, and in the battles of Pelennor Fields. It's the lonely path being trod through towards Mount Doom by Sam and Frodo, through a valley of death, as it were. Frodo not only at first walking, but ultimately just crawling, as it were, on a Via Dolorosa. And I think that's how we ought to see this, by the way, as a sort of a cross bearing. They're bearing a terrific burden on their backs. What is the burden? It's the burden of sin. The whole bearing of the ring needs to be seen as synonymous with bearing sin. And wearing the ring is equivalent to the act of sinning. Remember, Gandalf tells Frodo never to put on the ring, because the effect of putting on the ring is to render ourselves like Gollum. It's eviscerating us of all goodness, all presence, all virtue. And it is so in the sense that Frodo is bearing the burden of the ring, taking it to its ultimate destruction, Frodo is a Christ figure, a cross bearer, a one who will save the world by destroying sin, by laying down his life. On the other hand, he is a sort of the everyman figure because he bears his own particular cross. At the end of the day, what are we to make of the figure of Sam in all of this? Remember, I alluded to you or mentioned last time that it's really interesting in Tolkien's portrait of evil that although Frodo is bent down to the point where he can go on no longer because he says that the weight of the ring is so heavy that he can't walk, Sam is shocked when he says that he will help his master by lifting him up, and he finds not that Frodo and the ring have become so heavy that he can't bear them, but rather the burden is light. And then he reflects on this and wonders whether because Frodo was so worn by his long pains, wounds of knife and venomous sting, and sorrow, fear, and homeless wandering, or because of some gift of final strength was given him, Sam lifted Frodo with no more difficulty than if he were carrying a hobbit child piggyback in some romp on the lawns or the hayfields of the Shire. So for all of the perception on Frodo's part of the unbearable weight of bearing the ring, there is no correspondence of that for Sam, because Sam is not bearing sin for others, whereas Frodo has been. He's just simply bearing his master who has that. So he doesn't have the same function there. What then is Sam doing? Well, he's taking up his own particular cross. He's assisting Christ in the same way. For a brief time when Christ stumbles and falls, another bears the cross for him and carries it for a little bit. And he finds, as I say, to his utter shock and pleasant surprise, that the burden that he bears is in fact light. Because he is being given the light, which may be the light of grace, to bear this burden on the final path. When he does so, however, and I mentioned this in my little expose on the continued corrosive effect of bearing the ring, when Frodo puts on the ring 6 times, he comes to the end, and ultimately he does not do what he came to do. And he says, I have come, but I do not choose now to do what I came to do. I will not do this deed. The ring is mine. And then so instead of destroying the ring, casting it into the cracks of Mount Doom, he places it on his finger, and ultimately fails. And at this point, we realize a point of great frustration. I think it's a hard slog to get through a lengthy book like The Lord of the Rings, and for all of the providential successes to have been visited upon the reader, only to find that the hero, Frodo, will fail at the last gasp. But he does. We cannot see Frodo as a successful hero. He ultimately fails in his virtue. And Tolkien is telling us something, obviously, about this as well. Frodo is not an allegory for Christ. He is, in some sense, he points us towards a figure who will have to do the very Via Dolorosa, or tread the path of the Via Dolorosa, which Frodo does, but ultimately will be able to come to the end of that. Frodo fails in that, but nonetheless, he points us down the path that will have to be trod, the path of humility, the path of bearing the sin of others, a path which ultimately he will carry on to the end. But Frodo is not capable of doing that. He is a hobbit, he is humble, has virtue in his humility, but ultimately he does not have the power to defeat evil. He can't do it through a simple triumph of the will. He's not a Nietzschean Übermensch who even through humility can will his way to destroy evil through his goodness. And in the end, he falls prey to the same depravity that all the other characters do. And Tolkien's message, I think, is clear. We cannot do good without God. God alone can do his goodness. And ultimately, that's because there's a selfishness in the human heart, a pride, which is addictive. And the selfishness within us Gollumizes us. It renders us into forms of the figure of Gollum. Remember, Gollum in his original form was a quite happy little creature, Smeagol. But he gave in to the self-deception of evil, which characterizes all the figures of evil from Melkor on through Saruman and Sauron, all the way down to the poor, pathetic figure of Gollum. But grace is needed in the end. And grace is the very thing that triumphs here by the very figure of Gollum, who comes in at this point, bites the ring off Frodo's hand, and then falls into the cracks of Mount Doom and is destroyed so it's I think it's enormously important in the story to recognize how important this failure is, because in his last moments, when Gollum believes that he has triumphed, he plummets to his own destruction. And out of the depths came his last wail, "Precious!" And he was gone. Well, what are we to make of these final moments? The happy ending which he believed that he had received. He got what he wanted. He has received the thing for which he most longed and which he believed that he in the end has achieved. His success is a clear foil and contrast with Frodo's failure. One got what he wanted, the other failed to do what he most willed to do. How are we to understand that? I think we simply have to see the eucatastrophe, which Tolkien said was the heart of fairy stories, and which he presents himself here in The Lord of the Rings. And with that, I think I'll conclude for this final class and hope that you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon.